Love's blind spot. Love can blind us in ways we only realize when we're already in the abyss. My mistake nearly destroyed my entire family, and it began with a simple glance. Good morning, my dears. Today, at 82 years old, I've decided to share with you a story I've kept buried in my heart for decades. This account will be a bit different from what I usually share here on the channel. Today, I'll talk about one of the biggest mistakes I made in my life. Something that almost cost me everything I had. This happened a long time ago in 1965 when I was just 22 years old. And although I've grown so much since then, I believe I should be completely transparent with you. Before starting this difficult story, I'd like to ask those watching to please leave a like on this video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from today. This helps me continue sharing my stories with you all. Now let's begin. My name is Alice, and I had a sister named Lena who was 3 years older than me. We were never very close growing up. Lena was always considered the perfect daughter in the family, beautiful, studious, polite, and beloved by everyone in our small Midwestern town. I, on the other hand, always lived in her shadow. Wherever I went, I heard comments like, "You're Lena's sister, aren't you? Too bad you didn't inherit her beauty," or "Your sister was already top of her class at your age." Perhaps you know that feeling of always being compared to someone and never measuring up. My father, Joseph, was the only person who truly seemed to understand me. He had a small fabric store in town. Nothing grand, but enough to give us a comfortable life. When I felt sad because of the comparisons, he would always find time to sit with me in the backyard and say, "Little Alice, you have a heart of gold. One day, everyone will see that." These words kept me going on the hardest days. In January 1965, our lives changed completely. My father, who had been suffering from heart problems for several months, had a massive heart attack while working at the store. It happened so quickly. The doctors said he didn't suffer, but for those of us left behind, the suffering was just beginning. I had just turned 22 and felt like the ground had disappeared beneath my feet. My father's illness had already consumed a good portion of the family's savings on treatments and expensive medications. When he passed away, we discovered the financial situation was worse than we had imagined. The store wasn't selling like it used to. There were debts he had hidden so as not to worry us, and the bank account was nearly empty. It was at this moment that I saw a side of my sister I had never noticed before. Lena was engaged to Anthony, a newly qualified doctor who had arrived in town less than a year ago. The wedding was scheduled for 3 months later, and my father, before falling ill, had promised a sum to help with the preparations. Lena had already received this money and made several advance payments. When we gathered to discuss funeral arrangements, the conversation inevitably turned to finances. My mother, her eyes still red from crying, mentioned that we would need money to give my father a dignified burial. She looked at Lena and asked if she could return part of what she had received for the wedding, since we were in an emergency situation. What happened next has never left my memory. Lena turned red, crossed her arms, and said with a coldness that sent chills down my spine, "I've already put down deposits on the catering, the decorations, and I'm about to pay for the imported dress. I can't cancel anything now. I'd lose all the money." My mother, incredulous, insisted, "But Lena, it's your father's funeral. We can have a simpler wedding later." It was then that my sister said those words that cut through my heart like a knife. Dad would understand that I can't compromise my wedding because of this. He always wanted me to have the perfect wedding. If I give up anything now, I'll never be able to have the celebration I dreamed of. I looked at my mother at that moment and saw a mixture of pain and disappointment that I'll never forget. With no alternatives, we decided to sell the gold brooch that belonged to my paternal grandmother, a family heirloom that my mother had kept so carefully. "It's just an object," she said, trying to convince herself. "Joseph deserves a funeral worthy of the man he was." In the days that followed, as we prepared for my father's wake, Lena remained immersed in her wedding preparations. On the morning of the funeral itself, She left early because she had a dress fitting scheduled. "I can't cancel," she justified. "The seamstress has a very tight schedule." She returned only minutes before the ceremony began. Those days were the darkest of my life. I felt completely lost, as if I were drowning in a dark sea, unable to breathe. I began losing weight. I couldn't sleep properly, and often found myself crying without even realizing I had started. Today I know I was in a deep depression, but back then, in 1965, people hardly talked about mental health, especially in small towns like ours. The worst part was that no one seemed to notice my suffering. My mother was lost in her own grief. And Lena was too busy with her wedding to pay attention to anything else. The house was always full of invitation samples, flower catalogs, magazines with hairstyle models. It was as if my father's death had been merely an inconvenience in the grand plan of the perfect wedding. Lena's attitude only worsened as the weeks passed. She began forcing me to participate in the preparations, saying I needed to stop moping and move on. When I didn't show enough enthusiasm, she would make cutting remarks. "You should take better care of yourself. That way you might find someone someday." Or, "Dad wouldn't want to see you like this, all sloppy and depressed." One day, during a family lunch to discuss the final details of the wedding, Lena announced the names of the bridesmaids. My name wasn't on the list. When an aunt asked why I, the sister, wouldn't be a bridesmaid, Lena responded without hesitation. "Alice will ruin the photos with that sad face. Besides, she can't afford the dress I chose for the bridesmaids." I felt as if I'd been slapped in front of the entire family. I left the table without saying a word and went to the backyard where my father used to sit with me. There I let the tears flow freely. It was at this moment that I heard a voice behind me. "Are you okay?" It was Anthony, Lena's fiancé. We had never talked much, just the usual formalities. He was a handsome man with a kind manner and eyes that seemed to really see you. I tried to hide my tears, embarrassed, but he had already noticed. "You don't need to pretend with me," he said, sitting down beside me on the old wooden bench. "What Lena said was cruel. You didn't deserve that." I was surprised by his words. It was the first time someone had acknowledged my sister's behavior. "You're her sister," he continued. "You should be the maid of honor, regardless of anything." "Lena's always been this way," I replied, wiping away my tears. "Everything has to be perfect for her, and I never fit her definition of perfection." Anthony was quiet for a moment, then asked about my father, what he was like, what we used to do together, what memories I had. No one had asked me this since the funeral. Everyone avoided the subject, as if talking about him might break us even more. But I needed to talk, needed to keep his memory alive. I told Anthony about the afternoons we spent together at the store, how my father taught me to recognize different types of fabric, the stories he told about his childhood, his gentle smile. And I also told him about how Lena had refused to help with the funeral expenses. "She never mentioned that," said Anthony, visibly disturbed. "On the contrary, she told everyone she organized the funeral with great love and dedication." That first conversation lasted almost an hour. When we went back inside the house, something had changed. There was a connection between us, a silent understanding. In the days that followed, Anthony began visiting our house more frequently, always finding a moment to talk with me when Lena was busy with her preparations. He brought books he thought I might like. I had always been passionate about literature, another point where we differed. Lena never had patience for reading. We talked about dreams, fears, hopes. He told me about his plans to open a clinic in town, about the patients he treated, about how he wanted to make a difference in people's lives. For the first time in months, I felt seen, heard, valued. The pain of losing my father was still there, of course, but now there were small moments of light penetrating the darkness. One day, Anthony confessed he was having doubts about the wedding. He said he felt pressured by Lena's family and by the status the marriage would bring, but that he wasn't sure if it was what he really wanted. "The more I get to know Lena, the more I see a side of her that frightens me," he admitted. This obsession with the perfect wedding, as if it were more important than anything else, even more important than mourning her own father's death. I should have backed away at that moment. I should have recognized the dangerous ground we were treading on. But the truth is that in my vulnerability, those words were like a balm. Someone finally saw what I had seen for so long. The weeks passed, and our growing closeness continued. Lena was so absorbed in her preparations that she hardly noticed how much Anthony and I talked. Or perhaps she noticed and preferred to ignore it, confident that her plain sister could never threaten her relationship. 2 weeks before the wedding, Lena and I had a terrible argument. She accused me of trying to sabotage her big day, saying that my funeral face was making everyone uncomfortable. "It's out of jealousy, isn't it?" she shouted. "You can't stand that I'm going to have everything you'll never have." I ran to the porch, devastated by her words. That's where Anthony found me later that night. He had come to bring some invitation samples for Lena to approve, but she had gone out with friends to finalize details for her bachelorette party. "I heard about the fight," he said, sitting down beside me. "Lena had no right to talk to you that way." I told him, through tears, the things she had said. He listened in silence, and then without warning, held my hand. Our eyes met, and in that moment, something changed between us. He leaned in slowly and kissed me. It was a gentle kiss at first, as if he too were frightened by what we were doing. But soon it transformed into something more intense, urgent, as if we were both releasing all the attention and emotion we had repressed for weeks. When we separated, startled by what had just happened, he whispered, "This shouldn't have happened, but I can't bring myself to regret it." That night, we crossed a line that would change our lives forever. It was the beginning of a secret relationship that would last almost 2 months, full of furtive meetings, hidden letters, glances that carried promises that shouldn't have existed. I knew what we were doing was wrong. I knew that, no matter how much Lena had hurt me, nothing justified betraying my own sister that way. But at that moment of fragility, with the pain of my father's loss still so fresh, Anthony's attention and affection seemed the only thing keeping my head above water. Anthony told me he would break up with Lena, that he had never really loved her, that he had been pressured to ask for her hand in marriage for the social position it would bring. He promised we would be together after it was all over, and I, in my naivety and desperation for connection, believed every word. What I didn't know was that our time was running out quickly and that the price to pay would be much higher than I could ever have imagined. 2 weeks before the wedding, I began to notice changes in Lena. She watched me more closely, asked about my walks, wanted to know where I was going so frequently. That Saturday afternoon, I had met with Anthony in the town square. We spent just half an hour together, exchanging a few words. A quick kiss behind the large central tree, away from curious eyes. I returned home with my heart racing, as always happened after these forbidden meetings. When I entered my room, I immediately noticed something was different. My diary, which I always kept under the mattress, was on the bed, open exactly at the page where I had written about my first kiss with Anthony. I felt a chill run down my spine. The letters he had written to me, which I kept in a shoebox at the back of the closet, were also scattered on the bed. I heard footsteps in the hallway and turned to find Lena standing in the doorway. Her eyes were red and swollen. Her hands trembled, holding one of Anthony's most recent letters. "How could you?" she whispered, her voice breaking with pain and anger. "My own sister." I tried to explain. I babbled disconnected words about loneliness, about how everything happened without planning, but she didn't want to listen. "Spare me your excuses," she said, her voice now louder. "You've always envied me. You've always wanted what was mine since we were little. But this, stealing my fiancé 2 weeks before the wedding, that's too low even for you, Alice." That night was terrible. Lena locked herself in her room, refusing to speak to me or our mother, who didn't understand what was happening. The following day was Sunday, the day of the traditional family lunch. Uncles, aunts, cousins, all gathered for one of the last get-togethers before the big wedding. Mom had prepared a special roast chicken, Dad's favorite recipe, as a way of keeping him present in our lives. We were all at the table when Lena finally came downstairs. Her eyes were still swollen, but there was something different about her, a cold determination that frightened me. She waited until everyone had been served, until conversations began to flow, and then tapped her fork against the crystal glass, asking for attention. "I have an announcement to make," she said, her voice artificially calm. "The wedding is canceled." A perplexed silence fell over the table. Our Aunt Cecilia was the first to react. "But why, dear? Did you argue? I'm sure any disagreement can be resolved." Lena smiled, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "It's not a disagreement, Aunt. It's a betrayal." She then looked at me directly. "I discovered yesterday that Anthony and Alice have been having an affair for weeks, right under my nose, in my own home." It was as if a bomb had exploded in the dining room. All eyes turned to me, some incredulous, others accusatory. My mother dropped her fork, the metallic sound echoing in the shocked silence that followed. "Alice, is this true?" she asked, her voice barely audible. I couldn't answer. The shame, the guilt, everything mixed inside me, closing my throat. My silence was enough of an answer. "I found his letters," continued Lena, taking one from her dress pocket. "Do you want to hear what my fiancé wrote to my sister?" Without waiting for an answer, she began to read. "Alice, every moment away from you is torture. When I'm with Lena, I can only think of you, of your eyes, of your smile. I'll end everything with her after the rehearsal dinner, and then we can be together without hiding." A murmur of indignation swept through the table. Uncle Robert, my father's brother, banged his fist on the table. "What a disgrace. Your father is barely cold in his grave and you dishonor the family this way." I couldn't take it anymore. I got up from the table and ran to my room, tears blurring my vision. I could hear Lena's voice continuing downstairs, telling everyone the details she had discovered, painting me as the villain of the story, which in many ways I really was. A few hours later, I heard a scream coming from the living room. I ran downstairs and found my mother collapsed on the floor, her face contorted in pain. "She can't move the left side," shouted Aunt Cecilia in panic. "Someone call an ambulance!" My mother had suffered a small stroke, a consequence of the shock and stress. When the ambulance arrived, the paramedics looked at me with contempt. The news had already spread through the town. One of the nurses who had studied with me in high school whispered as she helped put my mother on the stretcher. "How could you do this to your own sister, Alice? Everyone's talking." It was at that moment that I understood the dimension of what I had done. It wasn't just a forbidden romance, a secret adventure. It was a betrayal that had divided my family, ruined my sister's reputation, and now put my mother's health at risk. At the hospital, I stayed in the corridor while Lena accompanied our mother. No one spoke to me. No one wanted me around. I tried calling Anthony several times from the payphone in the hospital corridor, but he didn't answer. I needed to know what we would do now, if he would really fulfill his promise that we would be together. The next morning, after an agonizing night sleeping in an uncomfortable hospital chair, I received the news that would completely shatter my already broken heart. Anthony had left town during the night, without saying goodbye to me, without saying goodbye to Lena. He simply packed his things and left, leaving only a short note for the hospital director where he worked, claiming a family emergency. "He's a coward," said Aunt Cecilia when she saw me crying in the corridor after receiving the news. "And you, Alice, are a fool. Did you really think a man who cheats with you wouldn't cheat on you too?" My mother stayed in the hospital for 2 weeks. When she was finally discharged, she could already speak, albeit with some difficulty, and walk with the help of a cane. Lena took care of her with dedication during all this time, while I kept my distance, sleeping at the house of a distant cousin who took pity on me. The day my mother returned home, I found my things packed in 2 old suitcases left on the porch. Uncle Robert was there, arms crossed, like a guard preventing my entry. "Lena and your mother have agreed it's better if you don't live here anymore," he said, avoiding looking directly at me. "I've arranged a bus ticket to the city. There you can start over, away from the gossip and the harm you've caused. I tried to protest, to say I wanted to talk to my mother, to apologize, but he was unyielding. You've caused enough suffering, Alice. Leave before your presence worsens her recovery. So at 22 years old, I found myself alone at the bus station with 2 suitcases containing everything that remained of my life and a one-way ticket to a big city. I had no money beyond what was enough for the first few days. I had no friends or acquaintances in the big city, no plans or hopes. In the first weeks in the city, I slept in a hostel for women run by nuns. It was a clean place, but austere, with strict rules about schedules and behavior. The other women there had their own stories of suffering and misfortune, but I kept mine a secret, too ashamed to share. During the day, I wandered the streets, looking for work. It was 1965, and for a young woman, without higher education or recommendations, the options were limited. After many attempts, I managed to get a job as a clerk in a small neighborhood pharmacy. The salary was minimal. It barely covered renting a room and feeding myself, but at least it allowed me to survive. The room I rented was in the attic of an old boarding house, poorly ventilated and suffocating in summer. I shared the bathroom with 5 other women, all workers like me, domestic servants, store attendants, secretaries in small offices. At night, lying in that narrow bed, looking at the peeling ceiling, I relived the events that had led me there, torturing myself with thoughts about what I could have done differently. In the first months, I wrote several letters to my mother. Long letters, begging for forgiveness, explaining how I felt at the time, how the pain of losing my father and Lena's coldness had left me vulnerable. I told her about my difficult life in the city, about the loneliness, about how bitterly I regretted what I had done. I never received a response. I discovered through a newspaper from my town, which occasionally reached the pharmacy, that Lena had moved to another city as well. Apparently, the malicious comments and the humiliation of the canceled wedding made it impossible for her to stay there. I felt an even sharper twinge of guilt. Not only had I betrayed my sister, but I had also forced her to abandon her home, her friends, her life. Time passed, slow and painful. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, months into years. I continued working at the pharmacy, eventually being promoted to manager when the owner, Mr. Morrison, noticed that I had a knack for numbers and good memory for medications. I moved to a small but decent apartment in a working-class neighborhood. I had no luxuries, but I didn't lack necessities either. I made some friends, met some men, had some brief romances, but whenever the relationship started to get serious, I backed away. I carried with me a deep fear of getting involved, of trusting, of loving again. Deep down, I believed I didn't deserve to be happy after what I had done. My routine was simple and predictable. I woke up early, had coffee at a small cafe near the apartment, worked all day at the pharmacy, returned home, had dinner alone, read a book, or listened to the radio until I fell asleep. On Sundays, I went to Mass at the neighborhood church, more out of habit and to break the loneliness than out of devotion. It was a small existence, without great joys or sorrows, just one day after another, in a city that never came to feel like home. In 1967, I managed to save enough money to buy a better radio. It was my only luxury, my connection to the world beyond the walls of my apartment and the pharmacy. I listened to music, news, radio dramas. Sometimes, when a song my father liked played, I closed my eyes and could almost feel his presence, as if he were there with me in that small space I called home. I still thought about Anthony occasionally, not with love or longing, but with a mixture of anger, shame, and curiosity. Where had he gone? Was he practicing medicine in another city? Had he found another woman to deceive? These questions came mainly on nights of insomnia, when the past seemed more present than the present itself. Mr. Morrison, my boss, became a sort of father figure to me. He was a widowed, middle-aged man with grown children who had moved to other cities. Noticing my loneliness, he began inviting me to Sunday lunches at his house. It was a kindness I accepted with gratitude, though I always felt a little out of place, like an intruder in others' lives. It was during one of these visits in early 1968 that I received the news that would change the course of my life again. The phone rang during lunch. It was for me, something extremely unusual, since almost no one knew I would be there. Mr. Morrison handed me the phone with a worried expression. "Alice?" The voice on the other end of the line was familiar, but different, older, more tired. It took me a few seconds to recognize. "Aunt Cecilia?" I asked hesitantly. "Yes, it's me, my child. I called the pharmacy and they told me you would be here today." I felt my heart speed up. If Aunt Cecilia had gone to the trouble of looking for me after so much time, something serious must have happened. "What's happened, Aunt? Is everything all right?" A heavy silence on the other end of the line. Then a deep sigh. "It's your mother, Alice. She's very ill. The doctors don't give her much time. She asked to see you." Those words fell on me like a bucket of cold water. My mother asking to see me after almost 3 years without any contact. She must be really bad. How is she?" I managed to ask, my voice breaking. "It's her heart. It's very weak. She had another stroke last week, smaller than the first, but in her weakened state." "Well, the doctors say it's a matter of days, maybe weeks." "I'm coming," I said without hesitation. "I'll take the first bus tomorrow morning." "Alice," Aunt Cecilia hesitated, as if carefully choosing her words. "Lena is here too. She came back as soon as she knew. You two, you'll have to meet." I felt a lump in my throat. Lena, my sister, whom I had betrayed in the worst possible way. How would it be to face her after everything? "I understand," was all I managed to say. "I'll arrive as quickly as possible." We hung up, and I returned to the lunch table on shaky legs. Mr. Morrison, noticing my pallor, offered a glass of water and a friendly ear. I told him briefly about the situation, omitting the most painful details of the past. He, with his usual kindness, didn't ask questions, just offered me a few days off so I could travel. That night, I packed a small suitcase, just the essentials for a few days. As I folded the few clothes I would take, my mind was in turmoil. What would it be like to see my mother again after so long? What would I say to her? Would I ask for forgiveness once more? And Lena? How would it be to face my sister again? I took the 6 a.m. bus. The 6-hour journey seemed to last an eternity. Every mile that brought me closer to my hometown made my stomach tighten more with anxiety. Looking out the window, seeing the landscape change from urban to rural, I felt as if I were traveling not only in space, but also in time, returning to a past I had tried to leave behind. When the bus finally entered the small town station, I had a strange feeling of déjà vu. Everything seemed exactly the same, frozen in time, while I had changed so much. The same small shops, the same cafe on the corner, the same familiar faces that now looked at me with a mixture of surprise and disapproval. Aunt Cecilia was waiting for me on the platform, older than I remembered. Her hair, once brown with some gray strands, was now completely white. The wrinkles in her face had deepened, marking the years of worry and hard work. She hugged me briefly, a gesture more formal than affectionate, and led me to the car. "Your mother has gotten worse in the last few hours," she said, as she drove through the familiar streets. "The doctors are there now." "And Lena?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Lena is with her all the time, hardly leaves the room." I sat in silence, unable to formulate an adequate response. The mention of my sister's name made my heart race with anxiety. What would I say to her? How would I ask forgiveness for something so serious? The car stopped in front of the house where I grew up, the same house where I had experienced moments of joy and deep sadness. It was strange to be there again, like a visitor, a stranger. Aunt Cecilia took my suitcase from the back seat and guided me to the door. "Prepare yourself," she said softly. "She's very different from how you remember." We entered, and the familiar smell of the house, a mixture of laundry detergent, old wood, and the slight scent of lavender that my mother always used hit me like a wave, bringing with it an avalanche of memories. Aunt Cecilia led me down the hallway to my mother's room, the same room she had shared with my father for so many years. In the hallway, standing in front of the door, was Lena. 3 years had passed since our last encounter, that fateful Sunday when everything fell apart. Lena was different, thinner, her face more angular, her eyes with small wrinkles at the corners. She wore a simple outfit, without the ornaments and jewelry she had loved so much in the past. Our eyes met, and for a moment, neither of us said anything. The weight of everything that had happened hung between us like an invisible barrier. Then, to my surprise, Lena took a step forward and said in a low voice, "She's waiting for you. She's conscious now, but comes and goes. It's better if you go in soon." There was no hostility in her voice, just tiredness and concern. I nodded, unable to speak, and entered the room. My mother was lying in the bed she had shared with my father for so many years. She seemed smaller, more fragile than in my memories. Her skin yellowish and her once brown hair now completely white. When she saw me, her eyes lit up for a brief moment. She extended her trembling hand in my direction, and I held it, feeling the fragile bones beneath the thin skin. "Alice," she whispered. "You came." It was then that the tears I had held back during the entire journey finally overflowed. I fell to my knees beside the bed, still holding her hand, and cried like a child. "Forgive me, Mom," I sobbed. "Please, forgive me." She caressed my hair with her free hand, a gesture so familiar and comforting that it only intensified my crying. "I forgave you a long time ago, my daughter," she said, her voice weak but clear. "Life is too short to hold grudges. I just wanted to see you one more time before I go." In the days that followed, my mother alternated between moments of lucidity and periods when she didn't recognize anyone. Lena and I took turns caring for her, initially in awkward silence, then with brief exchanges of practical information, until finally we began to have small conversations about our lives in the last 3 years. One night, after Mom finally fell asleep after a particularly difficult day, Lena called me to the kitchen, served 2 cups of tea, and sat at the table, indicating that I should do the same. For a long moment, we just drank in silence, the only sound coming from the old wall clock that Dad had fixed so many times. "There's something you should know," Lena finally said, placing the cup on the table. "About Anthony." My body stiffened at hearing that name, which I had tried so hard to forget. "What about him?" I asked, trying to sound indifferent, but failing miserably. "About a year after he left, I received a letter from a woman named Claudia," Lena continued, looking at her cup instead of at me. "She was a nurse in Springfield. Apparently, Anthony was engaged to her when he came to work in our town. He maintained the 2 engagements simultaneously, visiting her on holidays, telling us he was visiting his family. The revelation fell like lightning. Anthony, the man for whom I had ruined my family, the man who had promised eternal love, had deceived not only Lena, not only me, but a 3rd woman as well. "How did you find out it was true?" I asked, still stunned. "She sent photos, letters, even their engagement announcement published in the local newspaper," Lena replied. There was no denying it. Anthony is, a pathological liar. We were silent again, each absorbing the impact of that revelation. Suddenly, Lena did something that took me completely by surprise. She began to laugh, a low laugh at first, then louder, until it turned into an almost hysterical laugh. "What's so funny?" I asked, confused. "Us," she replied, wiping away tears of laughter. "We fought, we hated each other, we destroyed our family because of a man who was worth nothing, who was deceiving us both all along. Don't you see the irony?" And then, as if a dam had broken, I began to laugh too. We laughed together. We laughed until we were breathless. We laughed until the tears of amusement transformed into tears of shared sadness, of regret, of loss. When we finally calmed down, something had changed between us. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a beginning. I'm sorry, Lena, I said, finally managing to express what I had kept in my heart for so long. I'm sorry for everything. There's no excuse for what I did. She wiped her eyes, still bright with tears. I have things to apologize for too, she replied softly. I wasn't a good sister to you, Alice, especially after Dad died. I was so obsessed with the wedding, so concerned with appearances, that I lost sight of what really mattered. That night there was no great moment of reconciliation, no cinematic embrace or promises of eternal friendship, just a small step toward healing, a mutual recognition of mistakes made, and the possibility, perhaps, of a new beginning. My mother passed away 2 weeks after my arrival, in a quiet autumn dawn. She departed in her sleep, without pain, holding Lena's hand, who was dozing in the chair beside the bed. I was in the kitchen preparing tea when I heard my sister's muted crying. I ran to the room, and seeing the serene face of my mother, knew immediately that she had gone. The funeral was simple and dignified, quite different from the tumult that surrounded my father's burial. Few neighbors attended. Most people still looked at me with suspicion. And the presence of Lena, who had also left the town under controversial circumstances, didn't help attract many attendees. But it didn't matter. We were there, the two of us, to say goodbye to our mother, and that was what really counted. After the burial, we found ourselves facing the inevitable question: what to do with the house? It was the only asset our parents had left, and neither of us planned to move back to town. After some conversations, we decided to sell the property and divide the money equally. "Can we start over?" said Lena, as we packed family mementos on a rainy afternoon. "You in the city, me in the south, new places, new possibilities." It was strange working side by side with my sister after everything that had happened. As we organized clothes, sorted dishes, wrapped photographs, we talked about trivial things: the weather, the neighbors, small childhood memories. We avoided touching on the more painful subjects, as if we had made a silent agreement to leave the past behind. On the night before our departures, sitting on the porch with 2 cups of coffee, Lena finally broke this agreement. "I don't think I ever told you why I was so obsessed with that wedding," she said, looking at the starry sky. I remained silent, waiting for her to continue. "I was pregnant, Alice. 2 months along." The revelation hit me like a blow. You lost the baby?" I asked hesitantly. Lena nodded, her eyes fixed on some distant point. "When I found out about you and Anthony, I was so distraught that I felt ill. I started bleeding that very night after the Sunday lunch. I didn't tell anyone, not even Mom. And then at the hospital, while she was having the stroke, I was upstairs losing my child." I felt tears streaming down my face. The weight of what I had done, the pain I had caused, seemed even more unbearable. "Lena, I don't even know what to say." "It wouldn't have made a difference," she interrupted, her voice surprisingly calm. "What happened, happened. We can't change the past, only learn from it. And I've learned a lot in these 3 years, Alice. I've learned that life is too unpredictable and fragile to waste on resentments." We were silent for a long time, just listening to the crickets and the gentle wind in the leaves of the old maple tree in the yard. "I think it was for the best," Lena finally continued. "Imagine if I had married him, had that child. I would have been tied to a man who was worth nothing." "Does it still hurt?" I asked, referring not only to the loss of the baby, but to everything: the betrayal, the scandal, the destroyed dreams. "Sometimes," she answered honestly, "but not like before." "And you, Alice, do you still think about him?" I reflected for a moment. "Not the way you imagine. I think about what I did, the choices I made, the harm I caused. But Anthony is as if he were just a character in a sad story, not a real person for whom I still feel something." The next morning, we said goodbye at the bus station. Lena would board first, heading to the southern part of the country, where she had managed to get a job as a secretary in an export company. "Right," she said, hugging me briefly. It wasn't a warm embrace like those we exchanged in childhood before competition and resentment settled between us. But it was a beginning. "I'll write," I promised. And you too. I returned to the city with the strange feeling of starting a third life. The first had ended with my father's death and my betrayal. The second had been those 3 lonely years working at the pharmacy, living in the shadow of guilt. Now, with the money from the sale of the house, I had the chance to start over once more. The first thing I did was look for a better place to live. I found a small but sunny apartment in a quiet neighborhood. It had just 1 bedroom, a living room kitchen, and a bathroom. But for me, used to the precariousness of the boarding house room, it seemed like a palace. I bought some simple furniture, colorful curtains, plant pots. I wanted to create a space that was truly mine, that didn't carry painful memories. With the rest of the money, I made a decision that would change the course of my life. I went back to studying. At school, I had always been a good student, especially in science and mathematics. I enrolled in a teaching program to become an elementary school teacher, one of the few respectable career paths for a woman at that time. The first months were difficult. At 25, I was much older than most of the students, almost all girls of 17, 18 years, full of dreams and innocence. I felt out of place, as if I carried an invisible weight that separated me from them. But gradually I adapted, made some friends, found my place. The studies gave me a purpose, a direction. For the first time since the tragedy, I thought about the future with hope instead of apprehension. When I wasn't in class or studying, I continued working at the pharmacy, now on a reduced schedule. Mr. Morrison, as understanding as ever, adjusted my hours so I could balance work and studies. I maintained regular correspondence with Lena. Her letters, initially formal and short, became warmer and more detailed over time. She told me about her new life in the South, about how the climate was different, about her work at the export company, where she was quickly being promoted due to her efficiency. In exchange, I wrote about my studies, about the pharmacy, about small events of my daily life. In one of these letters, Lena mentioned that she had met someone. "His name is Gerald," she wrote. "He's a widower, has a small farm on the outskirts of the city. He's a simple man, but honest and kind. We've started seeing each other frequently, and he makes me feel at peace." Those words filled me with joy. My sister deserved this peace, this new beginning, this chance to be happy. Time passed, and our correspondence, though less frequent as our lives became busier, never ceased completely. It was as if we were, word by word, letter by letter, rebuilding a bridge over the abyss we had created between us. In 1969, 4 years after the tragedy that had separated our family, I received a letter from Lena with news that left me surprised and emotional. She and Gerald were engaged. "It will be a simple ceremony," she wrote, "just family and close friends. I know it's asking a lot after everything, but I'd like you to come, Alice. I'd like my sister to be present at my wedding." I read and reread that invitation several times, tears blurring my vision. It was more than a simple invitation to a ceremony. It was a gesture of forgiveness, of reconciliation, of hope for the future. I immediately replied, accepting the invitation with gratitude and emotion. The wedding took place on a sunny Sunday in September. Gerald's farm, though small, was beautiful and well kept. An improvised altar had been set up under a large tree in the garden, decorated with simple wildflowers. Lena was radiant in a light blue dress, without the ostentation she had planned for her previous wedding, but infinitely more beautiful in her genuine happiness. I was nervous when I met her before the ceremony. It was the first time we had seen each other in person since our mother's death, but my fears soon dissipated when she hugged me. A true embrace this time, full of warmth and meaning. "I'm so happy you came," she said, holding my hands. "It wouldn't be the same without you." During the ceremony, sitting among the few guests, I observed my sister pronounce her vows with a firm, clear voice. Looking at Gerald, I could see the genuine love in his eyes, the promise of a future built on trust and mutual respect. It was so different from the tumultuous relationship based on appearances that she had had with Anthony. At the small reception that followed, Lena introduced me to Gerald officially. He was a tall man, of kind appearance, with hands calloused from work in the fields and eyes that smiled along with his lips. "Your sister has told me a lot about you," he said, shaking my hand firmly. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you." "I hope she spoke well," I replied, half joking, half serious. "She told the truth," he said simply, "about the past, about the mistakes, about the learning, and about how you two are rebuilding your relationship one day at a time. That tells me a lot about the character of both of you." Those simple words spoken by a man who barely knew me touched something deep inside me. Perhaps it was possible, after all, not to be forever defined by the worst mistake I had made. Perhaps there was room for growth, for change, for redemption. I returned to the city the next day, carrying with me precious memories and a renewed feeling of hope. For the first time in a long time, I felt that the future might hold good things for me too. And so it was that, in the following weeks, when Mr. Morrison introduced me to a friend, a chemistry teacher named Otto, who frequently came to the pharmacy to buy materials for his experiments with students, I allowed myself to notice his kind smile, his attentive eyes that seemed to really see people. I allowed myself to respond to his interest, to talk about trivial subjects that gradually deepened. I allowed myself, for the first time in years, the possibility of opening my heart again. Otto was a widower, a few years older than me. His wife had died of pneumonia 2 years earlier, leaving him alone to foster his passion for teaching and books. We started talking about the weather, the medications he was looking for, the news of the day. Over time, the conversations became more personal. He told me about his wife, about his work at the public school, about his favorite authors. I cautiously shared small parts of my story, testing the waters, gauging his reactions. One day, after months of these sporadic conversations, he invited me for coffee after my shift. I hesitated, my heart racing. Since Anthony, I hadn't allowed myself any serious romantic involvement. The fear of hurting someone again, or of being hurt, was too great. "It's just coffee, Alice," he said, noticing my hesitation. "For us to talk without the interference of customers or Mr. Morrison asking you to reorganize the shelves." I accepted, still uncertain, but with a small flame of hope lighting up inside me. That coffee would mark the beginning of a new phase in my life. A phase I never imagined I deserved, but that I was finally ready to embrace. That first coffee with Otto turned into another, and then into a dinner. And soon we were meeting regularly. He was different from any man I had known. Patient, attentive, unhurried. He never pressed me, never demanded more than I was ready to give. There was a tranquility about him that calmed me. When he talked about his subject, chemistry, his eyes sparkled with genuine enthusiasm. "You see, Alice," he would say, drawing molecules on paper napkins, "the whole world is made of bonds, atoms that connect, transform, sometimes separate, but always seeking balance." I smiled, thinking how that seemed like a metaphor for human relationships too. Otto was 35 when we met, 7 years older than me. Experience was etched in his face, small wrinkles at the corners of his eyes, some gray hairs at the temples. He had lost his wife to pneumonia that complicated rapidly, leaving him devastated and alone. "For a time, I thought I would never feel anything but pain," he confessed one night as we walked after the movies. But then, one day, I realized that the sun still rose, flowers still bloomed, my students still needed to learn about chemical reactions. Life insisted on continuing. Those words resonated deeply with me. I too had known pain, regret, the feeling that I didn't deserve a new beginning. But there I was, 6 months after our first coffee, feeling my heart slowly open, like a hesitant flower after a long winter. In 1970, I completed the teaching program with good grades. I felt immensely proud of myself. At 27, I had transformed my life through effort and persistence. Soon, I got a position as a teacher at a municipal elementary school in the outskirts of the city. The salary wasn't much, but added to what I still earned working part-time at the pharmacy, it allowed me to live with modest comfort. It was at this time that I made one of the most difficult decisions of my life, to tell Otto the whole truth about my past. Our relationship was becoming serious, and I didn't want to build something important on secrets and omissions. I had learned in the worst possible way how lies, even by omission, can destroy not only relationships, but entire lives. I chose a quiet Sunday after a lunch I prepared in my apartment. With my heart in my throat and trembling hands, I related everything. My father's death, Lena's wedding, my involvement with Anthony, the tragedy that followed. I talked about my mother's stroke, about my exile in the city, about the years of guilt and loneliness. I omitted nothing, didn't soften my actions. I didn't try to justify myself. Otto listened to me in silence, without interrupting. When I finished, I was emotionally exhausted, as if I had run a marathon. "I understand if you want to leave now," I said, avoiding his gaze. "I know it's not easy to accept someone with a past like mine." To my surprise, he took my hands in his. "Alice," he said softly, "we all make mistakes, some bigger, some smaller, but we all carry scars from the past. What matters is what we learn from them, how we grow, how we become better people. I'm not afraid of your past," he continued. "I'm more afraid of a future without you." His words opened a floodgate inside me. I cried as I hadn't cried in years, not from sadness, but from relief, from gratitude, from an emotion I couldn't name. Otto embraced me, let me cry until I had no more tears, and then kissed me softly. In that moment, something healed inside me. Not completely. Some wounds never fully heal, but enough so that I could finally move forward, so that I could believe that I deserved a second chance, that I deserved to be happy. In July of that same year, Otto asked me to marry him. It was a simple proposal, without grand romantic gestures. Just the two of us, sitting on the small park bench where we used to walk on Sundays. "I want to build a life with you, Alice," he said, holding my hands. "A life based on honesty, respect, and love. Will you marry me?" I said yes, without hesitation. At 27, after so much suffering and learning, I was finally ready for a new beginning. Our wedding was small, just a few close friends, work colleagues, and of course Lena and Gerald, who made the long journey from the south especially for the occasion. When Lena hugged me after the ceremony, she whispered in my ear, "Dad would be proud of you, Alice, of who you've become." Her words were the best gift I could receive. The first years of marriage were ones of adaptation and discovery. We moved to a small but comfortable house, with a backyard where I planted flowers and aromatic herbs, reminding me of the garden at my parents' house. Otto continued teaching chemistry, and I dedicated myself to my classes of children at the municipal school, finding deep satisfaction in helping them discover the world of letters and numbers. In 1972, I discovered I was pregnant. The news brought a mixture of joy and apprehension. Joy for the life growing inside me, for the future that was opening up. Apprehension remembering Lena's lost pregnancy, for fear of what could go wrong. Otto was a rock during those months, always present, always patient with my anxieties, always ready to support me. Paul was born on a rainy winter morning, a healthy baby with rosy cheeks and powerful lungs as attested by his vigorous cry. When I put him to my breast for the first time, I felt a love so immense it barely fit in my body. It was as if all the pieces of my life finally fit together, as if all the suffering I had gone through had a purpose, to bring me to that moment, to that son. I wrote to Lena announcing the birth, and her response came full of joy and plans to visit her nephew soon. She also had news. She was pregnant with her first child. "Life is curious, isn't it?" she wrote. "After everything we went through, here we are, building our families, finding our way to happiness." The following years were filled with the joys and challenges of motherhood. In 1975, we had our second child, Cecilia, named in honor of my aunt, who, despite everything, had extended her hand when I needed it most. Raising two small children while working as a teacher wasn't easy, but Otto always shared the responsibilities with me, breaking the patterns of the time when childcare was considered women's work. Lena and Gerald prospered in the South. The farm expanded and, over time, transformed into a medium-sized dairy producer. They had 3 children, all boys, who grew up running through the open fields and helping their father with the cattle. We saw each other rarely, perhaps once every 2 or 3 years, usually during the end-of-year holidays, but we maintained contact through letters and occasional phone calls. Our relationship had found a comfortable balance. We weren't best friends, as some sisters are, but we had built a mutual respect and genuine affection, which, considering our turbulent past, seemed almost a miracle. On the rare occasions when we met, there was always an initial moment of discomfort, as if we both needed to remind ourselves that the past was truly in the past. But soon we fell into a pleasant routine of updates about children, work, small, everyday joys. In 1980, I managed to fulfill an old dream, to enter college for a degree in education. I was no longer young, I was 37, and studying while working and caring for 2 children wasn't easy. Many nights I spent bent over books after the children were asleep, preparing assignments, studying for tests. Otto always encouraged me, taking on more responsibilities at home to give me the time needed for studies. "You're an example for our children," he would say. "You show them that it's never too late to learn, to grow, to reinvent yourself." The graduation in 1984 was a moment of immense pride. Seeing my children, Paul at 12 and Cecilia at 9, applauding when I received my diploma, made me think about how life had given me much more than I ever imagined I deserved. Lena couldn't come to the ceremony, but she sent a bouquet of flowers with a card that I keep to this day. From the girl who lived in the shadow of the older sister to the woman who shines with her own light. I'm proud of you, my sister. With diploma in hand, I was promoted to pedagogical coordinator at the school where I taught. The new position brought more responsibilities, but also more professional satisfaction and a better salary. Otto, in turn, had become the principal of a state high school. We were what you might call a typical middle-class family. We weren't rich, but we had enough comfort, stability, and, mainly, we were happy. The 80s brought significant changes to the country. We were witnessing the birth of a new America, embracing its growing diversity, celebrating its progress, facing its challenges. As educators, Otto and I lived these transformations intensely, discussing politics at the dinner table, participating in teacher meetings, dreaming of a better country for our children. Paul, our firstborn, showed from an early age an inclination for the exact sciences, like his father. Intelligent and methodical, he spent hours dismantling electronic devices to understand how they worked. Cecilia, on the other hand, had inherited my love for literature. At 10, she had already devoured a good part of the children's classics and was beginning to explore more complex works. I tried to be the kind of mother I always wished I had, present, understanding, able to see each child as a unique individual, without unfair comparisons. The painful lessons of my past shaped the way I raised them. I never wanted them to feel what I had felt growing up, the feeling of always being measured and found wanting. In 1986, 21 years after that fateful spring of 1965, I received a phone call from Lena. Her voice sounded excited on the other end of the line. "You won't believe who I ran into by chance at a rural producers conference in Chicago," she said, without even greeting me first. My heart jumped. There was only one person whose mention could cause such a reaction in my sister after so long. "Anthony?" I asked, almost voiceless. "Exactly," confirmed Lena. "He's now a middle-aged doctor, with gray hair at the temples and a gold wedding band on his finger. He didn't recognize me immediately, or pretended not to recognize me." "What did you do?" I asked, curious about how my sister would have handled this unexpected encounter with our past. "I approached him during the coffee break," Lena recounted, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "You should have seen his face when I said my name. He turned white as a sheet, and then I just asked about his life, as any acquaintance would do. He stammered, said he was fine, that he had a prosperous clinic and 3 children. Then I excused myself and left, leaving him there, probably wondering if I would tell his wife anything. "And would you?" I asked. "Of course not," she replied immediately. "We would gain nothing from it, and other people would suffer. Some stories are better left in the past." I agreed with her. Anthony was part of a chapter in our lives that we had closed long ago. What mattered was the present, the people we loved, the lives we had built from the ashes of that tragedy. At the end of that year, our family made a trip to Lena and Gerald's farm in the south. It was summer, and the children, cousins who rarely saw each other, were soon running through the fields, swimming in the stream that cut through the property, helping to milk the cows under Gerald's watchful eye. Otto and I stayed in the main house, a simple but welcoming construction with wide porches where we sat on hot nights to talk and observe the stars. One of those nights, while the men discussed politics in the living room and the children played cards in the bedroom, Lena and I found ourselves alone on the back porch. The sky was incredibly starry, without the light pollution of the big city, and the full moon bathed the fields in silvery light. "Are you happy, Alice?" asked my sister, breaking a comfortable silence that had settled between us. I reflected for a moment before answering. "Yes," I said finally. "It's not the life I imagined when I was young. It's better in many ways, harder in others. But yes, I'm happy. And you?" Lena nodded, a small smile on her lips. "I am too. It's curious, isn't it? After everything we went through, after all the mistakes, the hurts, the losses, we found our way to happiness." "I think that's what it means to grow up," I replied, observing the moon that seemed so close we could almost touch it. "Learning from mistakes, moving forward, finding peace with the past." "Have you forgiven yourself, Alice?" asked Lena, turning to look at me directly. "Completely, I mean." The question took me by surprise. More than 20 years had passed since that terrible Sunday when everything fell apart. 20 years of pain, growth, learning, reconstruction. I reflected for a moment before answering. "I think so," I said finally. "It wasn't easy, and it took a long time, but I understood that I'm not just the worst mistake I made, that 22-year-old girl, hurt and confused, is not who I am today." Lena nodded, satisfied. "I'm glad to hear that because I forgave you a long time ago, Alice. Completely." Those words, simple but powerful, were like a final balm for an old wound, which, although it no longer hurt as before, was still there, somewhere deep inside me. I extended my hand and held hers, a gesture that said more than any word could express. We returned home after 2 wonderful weeks at the farm. Life followed its course. The children grew up, hair turned white, bodies began to protest with aches here and there. Otto and I retired. We saw Paul graduate in engineering and Cecilia in literature. We celebrated marriages, births of grandchildren, small and large achievements. Over the years, I maintained contact with Lena. Our relationship, although marked by the past, had found a healthy balance. We weren't the best friends we perhaps could have been without the tragedy that separated us, but we were sisters who had learned to respect and value each other, who had found the path of forgiveness and reconciliation. In 1995, when I was 52 and Lena was 55, I received a phone call that would change everything again. My sister's voice sounded different on the phone, low, almost hesitant. "Alice, I need to tell you something, but I don't want you to be alarmed." My heart immediately accelerated. In all my years as an educator, I learned that when someone begins a conversation asking us not to be alarmed, it's exactly what we should do. "What's happened, Lena?" "The boys are fine, Gerald. Everyone's fine," she quickly assured me. "It's about me. I had some tests last week. They found a lump in my left breast. I felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath my feet. Cancer." At that time, it was still almost a fatal sentence, especially in a small town in the interior, far from major medical centers. "I've already had the biopsy," continued Lena, her voice now firmer, as if she were making a conscious effort to sound pragmatic. "I'm waiting for the results, but the doctor here doesn't seem very optimistic. I'll need to go to Nashville for more tests." "I'm coming," I said immediately, without even thinking about the classes I would have to reorganize, the meetings I would have to postpone. "I can take a bus tomorrow." "No, Alice," she answered with that same determination that had always characterized her personality. "There's nothing you can do now. Let's wait for the definitive results. If it is what we fear, then we'll talk about the next steps." I respected her decision, although it was one of the hardest things I've ever done. In the days that followed, I lived glued to the phone, anxious for news. When they finally knew the result, it was what we feared: invasive breast carcinoma, already at an advanced stage. Lena would need to undergo a radical mastectomy, followed by radiation treatment. This time, I wouldn't take no for an answer. I talked to Otto, organized a leave from school, packed my bags, and took the first bus to the south. 24 hours of travel, during which my mind didn't stop for a second, alternating between childhood memories with Lena, desperate prayers, and practical planning about how I could help. When I arrived at the farm, I was shocked by my sister's appearance. Always strong and energetic, Lena seemed to have aged 10 years in a matter of weeks. She was thinner, with deep dark circles, her face marked by worry. Gerald received me with a tight hug, whispering a "thank you for coming" that said more than 1,000 words. Lena's 3 sons were already adults at this time, but all returned home upon learning of their mother's illness. The oldest, Robert, had taken over part of the farm administration. The middle one, Charles, was a veterinarian and cared for the herd. The youngest, Philip, was studying agricultural engineering in Nashville, but had paused the semester to be close to the family. The surgery was scheduled for the following week in Nashville. We decided that I would accompany Lena while Gerald would stay at the farm with the children, ensuring that everything continued to function. On the eve of our trip, I found my sister sitting on the house's porch, looking at the horizon where the sun was setting in shades of orange and red. "What are you thinking about?" I asked, sitting beside her. "About how strange it is," she replied, without diverting her gaze from the horizon. "I spent so much time worried about appearances, about what people would think of me. That wedding that never happened, how much energy I wasted on it. And now, all I can think about is my children, Gerald, you, the people I love, the time I want to have with you all." We were silent for a few moments, contemplating the sky that was gradually darkening. "I'm afraid, Alice," she finally confessed, her voice almost a whisper. "Not of death itself, but of suffering, of losing my dignity, of being a burden." I took her hand in mine, feeling the fragility of the bones beneath the skin, which was beginning to show signs of age. "You will never be a burden," I said firmly, "and we won't let you suffer. We'll be by your side every step of the way." The days in Nashville were a blur of hospital, doctors, nurses, forms to fill out, difficult decisions to make. The surgery was long and complex. I stayed in the waiting room for 8 hours, alternating between pacing back and forth and praying silently. When the doctor finally appeared, his tired face didn't bring good news. They had found metastases in the lymph nodes. The cancer was spreading. The months that followed were a constant battle. Lena faced exhausting radiation sessions, lost her hair, suffered from terrible nausea, saw her body transform before her eyes. Through all this, she maintained a dignity and strength that left me amazed. I arranged an extended leave from school and began dividing my time between the city, where Otto and our now adult children took care of our house, and the farm in the south, where I helped care for Lena. It was during this period, sitting at the kitchen table, late at night, after Lena finally managed to sleep for a few hours, that Gerald told me something I never forgot. "You know what the first thing Lena said to me was when she learned of the diagnosis?" he asked, absently stirring the coffee that had already gone cold. She said, "Gerald, promise that you'll keep in touch with my sister Alice after I'm gone. She's stronger than she thinks, but she shouldn't be alone." I cried hearing that, silently, so as not to wake Lena in the next room. After everything we had been through, after all the pain I had caused her, my sister still worried about me. For almost a year, life continued at this strange rhythm, suspended between hope and despair. There were good moments, days when Lena felt strong enough to walk in the garden, to sit on the porch and read to the grandchildren who came to visit her, to participate in conversations at the dinner table. And there were terrible days of uncontrollable pain, of devastating side effects, of visits to the emergency room in the middle of the night. On a particularly good afternoon, when Lena had just finished her last radiation session and the doctors were cautiously talking about remission, we were both alone in her room. She had lost a lot of weight. Her face was pale, and her hair, which was starting to grow back, was now completely white, but her eyes still had that vivacity that had always characterized her. "Alice," she said, adjusting herself against the pillows, "I want to ask you something." "Anything," I replied promptly, holding her fragile hand. "I want you to promise that you will continue living fully no matter what happens to me, that you will enjoy each day, that you will love your children and grandchildren, that you will travel, learn new things, laugh a lot." "Lena," I began, but she interrupted me. "I'm in remission now and I intend to stay that way for a long time," she said with determination. "But we both know that life is unpredictable. And if something happens, I want to know that you'll be all right, that all this time we spent apart, all this suffering, served to teach us to value each moment." I promised with tears in my eyes, although deep down I believed, needed to believe, that Lena would win this battle, that we would have many years still ahead. And for a time, it seemed that my faith was justified. Lena improved significantly. The tests showed that the cancer had receded, and although the doctors never used the word cure, they spoke of disease control with cautious optimism. She became involved again with the farm administration, planning renovations to the house, dreaming of trips she would make when she was stronger. I returned to my routine in the city, calling my sister several times a week, visiting her every 2 months. Life resumed its normal course, or as normal as possible after an experience like that. Paul announced that he would be a father, bringing the joy of a new beginning to our family. Cecilia completed her master's in literature, fulfilling a dream she had nurtured since adolescence. In 1997, 2 years after the initial diagnosis, I received another phone call that froze my spine. It was Gerald, his voice breaking. "Alice, she's in the hospital. The cancer came back, now in the bones and liver. The doctors say there isn't much more to do, besides controlling the pain." Once again I packed my bags and traveled to the south, my heart heavy with sadness and fear. I found Lena in a hospital room, connected to tubes and monitors, her skin yellowed by liver dysfunction. Even so, when she saw me, she opened a weak smile that illuminated her face. "You came," she whispered. "Of course I came," I replied, holding her hand carefully so as not to dislodge the IV needle. "I'll always come when you need me." The following weeks were a slow and painful goodbye. Lena was transferred to the house, where a palliative care team helped control her pain and provide as much comfort as possible. I slept on a small mattress beside her bed, waking up several times during the night to check if she needed anything, to adjust her pillow, to administer medication. Sometimes, when the morphine eased the pain enough for her to talk, we would remember our childhood, the games in the yard, the stories our father told before bed, the simple but joy-filled birthday parties. We talked about our children, about how they had grown to become adults who filled us with pride. We talked about the future, a future that I pretended to believe would include her, although we both knew the truth. In one of these conversations, Lena asked me a question that would forever remain in my memory. "Do you think our parents would be proud of us, Alice, despite everything?" I reflected for a moment. "I think so," I finally replied. "We made mistakes, we hurt each other, we lost our way for a time, but we found our way back to each other. We built meaningful lives, we raised good and decent children. Yes, I think they would be proud." Lena nodded, satisfied, and closed her eyes, exhausted from the effort of talking. "I'm happy we had this second chance," she murmured, already almost asleep. "Happy we found our way back to being real sisters." On a Sunday morning, almost 3 months after my arrival, I woke up to the silence. A different silence, deeper than usual. I knew, even before looking at the bed beside me, that Lena had departed during the night. Her face was serene, without a trace of the pain that had tormented her in the last weeks. She seemed just asleep, as if she could wake at any moment and ask for a glass of water or ask what time it was. I sat on the edge of the bed and held her still warm hand for the last time. "Goodbye, my sister," I whispered. "Thank you for teaching me about forgiveness, about new beginnings, about love that persists despite everything." The funeral was held in the small chapel of the town, followed by burial in the local cemetery where our parents also rested. It was packed. It seemed the entire community had appeared to pay their last respects. Lena had touched many lives during her years of existence. I heard stories about her generosity, about how she helped families in difficulty, about her volunteer work at the rural school. Otto, Paul, and Cecilia came for the funeral, bringing support and comfort in the difficult days that followed. Gerald, destroyed by the loss of his wife, found strength only for the good of his children and grandchildren. At night, when everyone slept, I heard him crying softly in his room, the room he had shared with Lena for almost 3 decades. I returned home a week later, carrying with me not only the sadness of loss, but also a deep gratitude for the time we had together, for the barriers we managed to break down, for the love that, despite all the hurts, managed to bloom again between us. In the years that followed, I maintained close contact with Lena's family. I called Gerald regularly, visited the farm when I could, closely followed the growth of the grandchildren. It was a way to honor my sister's memory, to keep alive the bond we had rebuilt with so much effort. Life continued its course. Otto and I fully retired, dedicating our time to personal projects and to the grandchildren who arrived in increasing numbers. We traveled, visited places we had always dreamed of seeing. We enjoyed the freedom that retirement gave us. In 2010, Otto was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. It was devastating to see that brilliant mind that had taught me about molecules and chemical bonds gradually fade away. I took on the role of caregiver, learning to deal with the daily challenges the disease brought. In the most difficult moments, I remembered Lena and her battle against cancer, how she maintained dignity until the end, and this gave me strength to continue. Otto passed away in 2015, after 5 years of gradual decline. I became a widow at 72, after more than 4 decades of a happy marriage. It was a hard blow, but I wasn't alone. My children and grandchildren surrounded me with love and attention, and I had learned, throughout a life of losses and new beginnings, that pain, no matter how intense, doesn't last forever. Today, at 82, I look back and see a life marked by mistakes and successes, by falls and recoveries, by pain and joy. The mistake I made at 22 could have defined my entire existence, could have condemned me to a life of bitterness and isolation. But somehow I found the strength to rebuild, to seek forgiveness, to become a better person from the ashes of my greatest mistake. I learned that we are not defined by our worst moments, but by how we respond to them, how we grow from them, how we use our scars to become more compassionate, more understanding, more human. The story I've shared with you today is not just about a betrayal, about a forbidden affair that destroyed a family. It's about redemption, about second chances, about the human capacity to forgive and be forgiven. If there's something I'd like you to take from this story, my dears, it's that it's never too late to start over, to seek forgiveness, to build a meaningful life from the rubble of our mistakes. Our past choices don't need to determine our future. We can always choose a different path. We can always choose love, compassion, truth. The journey won't be easy. Mine certainly wasn't. There will be days of doubt, of guilt, of fear. But if we persist, if we face our shadows with courage and honesty, we can find, as I found, a peace that seemed impossible at the height of our despair. And as for love, well, true love isn't that overwhelming passion that blinds us to everything else, that makes us ignore boundaries and betray trust. True love is patient, generous, honest. It's what Otto taught me throughout our years together. It's what Lena and I, despite everything, managed to rebuild as sisters. It's what I try to pass on to my children and grandchildren every day. So, if you're going through a difficult time, if you've made mistakes that seem irreparable, if you feel there's no way out of the darkness you find yourself in, remember my story. Remember that a 22-year-old girl who betrayed her own sister and destroyed her family managed, with time, effort, and much love, to rebuild her life and find peace. You can too, no matter how deep the abyss in which you find yourself. There is always a path back to the light. Just take the first step, and then another and another. One day at a time, one choice at a time, until you realize you're no longer the same person who made those mistakes, that you've grown, learned, transformed. This is the message I leave you with today. The most valuable lesson I learned in my 82 years of life. We are more than our mistakes. We are our capacity to learn from them, to repair them, to use our experience to help others who may be treading similar paths. And now, if you'll allow me, I'd like to ask again, if this story touched your heart, please leave your like, subscribe to the channel for more accounts like this, and tell me in the comments if you've ever experienced a situation where forgiveness, whether giving or receiving it, transformed your life. Your stories inspire me to continue sharing mine, even the most difficult and painful ones.